Hi everyone, it's Ciara with Aixterior, and today I'm going to show you how to render an exterior asset with Blender cycles. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to delete the cube by pressing X, and then I'm going to navigate to the Aixterior website where I'd like to pick out some assets for us to use. So I'm just going to go to the browse page here, and I've actually already bought some assets that I like. So if you watched the last tutorial, you'll remember this little guy, and I chose this asset because I really like it and I think it's quite useful for what I'm trying to demonstrate. So I'm going to now set up some custom download settings for us since we won't need every single map that is available by default. I'm going to leave the resolution at 8K for now since we want a really nice looking demo. And then for my download settings, I want to use a displacement workflow in Blender. So I'm going to download the SDiv1. I'm not going to download the LODs since I'm not going to use them for this particular tutorial. I don't need my ambient occlusion. I do want my displacement. I do want roughness. I want vegetation. And I want my high normal. I don't need my normal LODs. And I don't need my previews. I'll go into the meaning behind any of these maps if you're not familiar with all of them in another tutorial. So this is actually sufficient for now. We don't need that many maps for this tutorial. I'm just going to go ahead and close that and press pack and download. Great, my download has started. And this might take a little while, so while we're here, we may as well also download the HDR. Since we, again, want a nice realistic looking demo, we may as well use one of the exterior HDRs as well. So again, I'm going to leave it at 8K. I think that should be sufficient since we're just using it as a background for our render. And I actually don't want the previews in this case. And again, pack and download. Okay, so now everything has downloaded. I've got my trunk files here and my HDR here, so we can get started right away. And we can load our asset into our scene. So I'm going to have to use the importer. I'm just going to copy this file path and then go to File, Import, and FBX, and then locate my file. And I'm selecting SDiv1 here. And that worked. I'm just going to press comma on the keypad to center my camera. So now I've selected my asset, and as you can see in this menu that pops up when I toggle N, which is just information and a general toolkit, you can see that the scale is actually not correct. This is just because there is a lot of discrepancy between FBX importers, so just be conscious between different softwares. This may happen, and I'm going to have to reset it because otherwise we may have problems with our displacement workflow later. So in order for this to be nice and clean, I'm going to go to Object and then Apply, and while I have my asset selected, I'm going to press Scale, and you can see here that it's now reset the scale to be 1, which is perfect, and it's not going to disrupt any kind of math that we're messing around with later on. Okay, cool, so we've got our nice clean asset here, and now I'm going to set up our workspace. So I'm just going to drag out one panel here, and then another panel. So I'm going to have one panel for our camera view, which I'm going to navigate to by pressing 0 on the keypad. And here I have the 3D view. And here I'm going to change this panel to be the shader editor so that we have a nice overview of everything that's going on. Okay, so let's get our material set up. So first things first, I'm going to change our render engine to Cycles, since that's what I want to show for now. And since Cycles does not fully support displacement workflow yet, I'm going to have to change this to Experimental. And then I'm going to change this to GPU because that's what my PC is capable of, whatever works best for you. Okay, now our scene is ready to start with the shading process, but before we actually start making the material for this asset, we need to work with light to be able to see what we're doing. So I'm just going to navigate to the world context. So first thing I'm going to do is press Shift A for a shortcut for my search, and then search for the environment texture node. And then I'm going to navigate to my HDRI that we already downloaded. I have it open already here in the Explorer, so I'm just going to copy that directory, paste it in here, and locate that. Okay, cool. And then I'm just going to connect that to our background and then click on our viewport shading here. And there we go. We've got our nice HDRI set up. I've now moved out of the camera view, so I'm going to press 0 on our keypad, and then I'm going to press N to toggle the menu, and then go to View here and click on Camera to View. So now if I toggle N to close that menu again, I can now move my camera around the object here, which is great. So next thing we have to do is save. Very important. I'm gonna open my file save as menu here and save to our desktop. I'm just gonna call this file tutorial and save that there. Another thing we may want to do is to be able to rotate our HDR to get the optimal lighting setup. So in order to do that, I'm going to press Shift A to add a node and then search for the mapping node and then plug that into our EXR vector. And then I'm going to search for the texture coordinate node. So Shift A again, texture coordinate, and then I'm going to connect that to the vector. And now if I change this axis here, my HDR is rotating, as you can see here. So it's a little bit laggy, but it is working. I'm going to leave our HDR in that position for now because we will want to tweak it when we've got our material set up. But before I start setting that material up, I'm going to just add a ground plane. So I'm just going to add mesh and then plane and then pressing S to scale. This is just going to give us a little bit of an easier time understanding what is going on with the lighting and the textures and everything. Okay, cool. So now we can actually start making our material. So in preparation for our material setup, I'm going to just get a nice camera angle that allows me to be able to really see what's going on with the details of our object. Okay, so let's switch to the object mode and create a new material for our trunk. So just select it and press new. Note that Cycles automatically creates a principled BSDF shader, but that's perfectly fine because that's what we need anyway. And first thing I'm going to do is name our material, and I'm just going to copy the same name as is on our FBX. So before we start bringing in our maps, we actually need to apply a subdivision surface to this object in order to be able to give it a bit of geometry to work with. So I'm just going down here and clicking on subdivision surface. And this subdivision surface is automatically set to having 1 subdivision level in the viewport and 2 in the renderer. I'm actually going to up this because I really want to see what's going on and have the displacement be very easy to read. So I'm going to up that to 2. And with that, we can actually import our displacement map. So I've got this folder here, which you might remember of all the files that I downloaded earlier. I'm just going to drag and drop our displacement map into the scene. I also just want to take a second to point out that it's important to note that you have downloaded the right displacement map for you. So in this case, the displacement map that we have is just called displacement, but on the Aixterior website, we also offer a world space displacement map. The difference between these two is that the displacement map that you see here is normalized, which means that all of the values have been set between 0 and 1. The world space displacement has real world values, basically meaning that it is using values above and below 0. That is more appropriate for render engines like Redshift. What this is more appropriate for render engines like Cycles and Octane and that kind of stuff. So just be aware of that. Okay, so back to our shader editor. Notice that the displacement node is already set to the linear color space, and that's because it's an EXR, which is great. But in order for Cycles to be really able to understand what this map is, it needs a little help. So I'm going to press Shift A and then find the displacement node. And what you see here is a node that is showing us a couple of different things. So I'm going to bring the displacement EXR into our height because that is what the information that it is giving. And here you see we have a mid level of 0.5 and a scale of 1. That's actually probably going to be a bit too much, but just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to plug it in and show you anyway. So let's go over here and plug this in. Okay, so we actually already have a response coming from the material, but as you can see, it doesn't really look very great. It doesn't really look right because in the material, we need to actually go down to our settings here and then go down to displacement. And you can see that it's set to bump only. We actually need it to be displacement only. In this case, I'm not going to set it to displacement and bump because we are using a normal map and you don't want to use a normal and a bump map at the same time, at least in this case. So as you can see, we've got some contemporary art going on here, but we can fix this. Right, so harkening back to when I mentioned that the scale might be a bit too much, this is what I was referring to. So let's dial it back down to 0.1. And this is a lot of trial and error, so don't be worried if your asset immediately doesn't look absolutely perfect. It's a little bit of tweaking here and there, but for now this is pretty nice. So now we're ready to bring in our normal map, but the first thing we want to do is, before we do that, we're going to dial down our base color to be like a mid-gray because it makes it, as you can see, a lot easier for us to see the surface details. And in order to work a little bit faster and more effectively, I'm just going to unplug the displacement for now. I can always reconnect it at the end, but just for the sake of working effectively and going a little bit easier on our computers, let's leave it for now. So I'm going to bring in our normal map. I already downloaded the high normal. In this case, that's the one that is the most appropriate for what I need. So I'm just going to drop that in. And you can see here that the color space is not set correctly, so I'm going to change that to non-color. This is important to note because normal maps are encoding vectors, not color. So we need to make sure that the color mapping and color space is always set correctly. Otherwise, we're going to get some really funky looking normals. And same with the displacement, we actually need a node to help Blender understand that this is a normal map. So we're going to use the normal map node, and we can just connect that up there, connect it into the normal input. And if we have a close look, we can see that there are now all these lovely fine details like the rings on the wood and all this kind of nice stuff that is more high frequency detail that is going to add a lot of lovely realism and just juicy details to our assets. So great, that worked. Cool, so we've got all these nice juicy details. We can now add our albedo map. So I'm just going to bring up our folder again and drag and drop our albedo in there. And then connect it to our base color. And that's already looking really cool. But it could be even better if we go to our render settings and go all the way down to color management here. In our look, we can set this to medium high contrast, and now see it looks even more interesting. Yeah, that's just going to make it a little bit easier on our eyes. It's not actually affecting the material or anything. It's just affecting the rendering process itself, but it looks better. There are actually a lot of ways that we can make this asset look even better. So you may have noticed that there are these green patches on this asset. This is actually moss, but because we don't have a subsurface and a vegetation setup for it, it's looking a little bit like slime right now, which is not ideal. So if you see here, we've got this subsurface input, and if we up that to say 0.5-ish, it's looking a bit crazy, but there is subsurface scattering happening, which is where light partially penetrates the object and bounces around inside, which is what happens with vegetation. So we want to try and set up a material that allows this to happen for only the areas where we have this mossy vegetation so that it looks a little bit more pleasing to the eye and more realistic. So one easy way that we can do something about this already is by connecting, because as you can see, this is just a white, waxy looking thing. We can connect our albedo to the subsurface color here. And that already does a lot. You can see that these areas now look a lot softer, a lot more alive and organic, but wood is not translucent. So this isn't really ideal. So now we need to basically create a setup to accommodate for this. So that's actually a very easy process to do. I can create a mix shader and then mix between our two separate materials that will accommodate for both the vegetation on the object and the wood and other solid stuff that does not need translucency and subsurface scattering. But before we do that, you can see here that this has got a bit of a weird orange tint going on. That's because the subsurface radius here is actually not normalized. So let's change that. When I say normalized, I mean that they are not all the same. So we have 1, 0.2, 0.1. This is not ideal, and that's what's creating this weird tint. So what I'm going to do is just press Shift A and search for a value node, and that's going to help us just even out these values here. And as you can see, that's already a lot more like what we first saw before we had any kind of subsurface setup. We can even set it to 0.2 to make it a little bit more harsh, a little bit more contrasty. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so if we're talking about mixing two separate shaders and having some areas having one shader and some areas having another shader, the key component we need is a mask or a piece of data that tells the shader, this is the part where I want you to use shader A, and the other part that wants you to use shader B. We actually already have one of those. It's called a vegetation map. And this is just a black and white map that is showing you here is vegetation where there's white, and black meaning there's no vegetation there. So we can drop this into our scene and it's going to be perfect for what we need with mixing our two shaders together. If you want to make sure that it's the right one, you can also just plug it straight into Surface here and you see that it's mapping everything correctly. Great. Let's just reconnect that and then we can start to use this. So I'm just going to clean up a little bit here. I'm going to press N to toggle that window there so we have a bit more space, and I'm going to zoom out, move our vegetation over, just get a little bit more of an overview here because tidiness is key so we don't end up accidentally cutting off nodes and all that kind of stuff. So perfect. Okay, so in order to have a distinction between our two materials, as in some of the subsurface stuff happening in some parts and having it not happen in other parts, we're going to need another shader. So I'm going to press Shift A and then get another principled BSDF. Let's open that up so it doesn't clip into anything, and I'm just going to close this one for now. Save some space, and I'm going to also create our mix node. And this is basically just going to, as the name describes, mix these two shaders together, driven by, in this case, our vegetation map. So for the purpose of demonstration, let's change this base color to something mad, like orange, and we can then add this in here, connect that to that, and then connect our mix shader to our surface. So you can see this is bright orange now. But if I move our vegetation map over here and then use that to control this FAC, meaning factor here, I can add that in there. And now you can see we've got patches here that are appearing where our vegetation map should be. So perfect. So our asset is bright orange, but that's actually fine because it's highlighting in orange all of the parts that are not receiving subsurface scattering. So in this case, that's ideal. So now what we can do is connect our maps to this other shader too. And now we have a asset that has, as you can see, some nice subsurface scattering going on here. Very subtle for now, but we're going to work on that. And some nice hard shading going on the wood parts themselves. So now we're actually basically finished. The only thing that we have left to do is to bring in our roughness, which for those of you who are familiar, roughness is key for photorealism. So we'll bring that in. And the first thing to note is that we need to make sure that we again interpolate the color space correctly. So because roughness is a value map, we need to interpret it as linear. And then we're going to plug that into just our wood shader here. And as you can see, that brings so much to the asset. Perfect. We're actually not going to plug the roughness map into our subsurface scattering shader because even though if you want to be very technical about this, it's completely faked, because in reality what's happening here with these patches of moss and so on is that there are hundreds of thousands of tiny little tree-like organisms all densely packed together. We could actually do this. Aixterior also offers individual strands of moss and packing it on there and everything, but obviously that's a bit overkill. And when you use this methodology, you're just basically approximating what is happening in the real world, which is that light is coming in from the sun or from whatever source of light there is, hitting these strands of moss and then bouncing around inside and getting trapped in there. So as a result of this, there is this soft diffusion of light happening within these patches of plants. So as a result of this, there is very little light that is hitting the surface and bouncing directly off of it. And a way of faking this effect is just by turning down the specularity. And as you can see now, it already looks more dark, more detailed, more dense. We can see more of what's going on the albedo map. That is, again, adding to this faked but very convincing version of what the moss should look like. And this is because in reality, all of this trapped light that I was talking about makes these patches of moss or patches of grass or whatever appear a lot darker than they actually are because of all the light that is getting trapped in there and not being able to bounce back out, which is causing that reflection. Okay, so with that ramble over, we basically have our shader now. So the last thing I need to do is press save. So Control S, very important. And then we can plug our displacement map back in. So I'm just gonna do that and wait for cycles to update. Great, cycles has updated and it's looking very nice, but also maybe a little crazy. So I'm gonna dial down the scale to 0.05. Now this is looking maybe a little bit too subtle, so let's come up with a nice compromise and do 0.075. Perfect. I'm really happy with this result. I'm gonna just get a nice angle going on, maybe turn off our viewport overlay so we can see a little bit better. Something like this maybe. Yeah, looks good. So now we can go to our render settings again and change our sampling. Set our samples to 200. Change our viewport to flat textured shading again and kick off a render. So we're just going to go to render and then press render image. And now we just have to wait for that to be ready. Ta-da! And now you know how to set up an asset with a displacement workflow and subsurface scattering in Blender Cycles. Thanks so much for listening and see you next time. Bye!